In 2013, Google bought an app called Waze for around $1 billion. That's one followed by 9 zeros. That's a lot of money. And today we're going to talk about 4 specific lessons you can learn as a no-code app entrepreneur from the success that Waze found. Hey, it's Kristen over at Coaching No Code Apps. We help non-technical entrepreneurs build custom apps so they can launch their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses all without coding. And if that's what you're doing, then subscribe for new videos to help you every single week. The concept of Waze is pretty simple, but at the time it was hard to convey. Waze was started by 3 Israeli founders on their balcony of all places, and when they initially launched, the idea was to sort of disrupt navigational apps that currently existed that didn't happen using live and updated data. So when you use a navigation app to drive somewhere, it wouldn't account for things like traffic or accidents or any other obstacles you might face when trying to get from point A to point B. Waze wanted to change that. Essentially, they wanted people to drive around using the app. The app would intake data from where they're driving and what they're encountering on their routes, and then it would show users different routes that they can take when they're trying to get from one place to another. So while the quickest route in terms of distance, or the shortest route rather, might be how most people would travel, Waze would be able to see when there was traffic on that route and direct people to a different route, maybe longer in length, but shorter in overall time. You might use Waze. If not, then you use Google Maps or some other navigation app that works similarly. So again, now this isn't really new, but at the time, the founders of Waze kind of had a hard time conveying their ultimate vision and the true value of the app. So here's kind of a brief timeline of Waze. The founders initially launched a first version of the app in Israel, and users started using the app, but in the beginning it was pretty buggy. I mean, this type of app would be fairly buggy and there was a lot to iron out. But they did pick up some traction in Israel, and then they started to seek out funding so that they could further grow. But they ran into a number of roadblocks because, again, they really struggled to convey their ultimate vision with Waze, and they had a hard time relaying the value of the app, and so they couldn't get any investment to help them grow. So they continued pushing forward and were pretty relentless about that, honestly, and they tried to come into the United States. Now, initially it was kind of a disaster. Some of the routes would try to guide people, from driving across a bridge and sort of direct them to then take a turn, and it would lead them to a road down below the bridge. So obviously things weren't going great in terms of the functionality. But again, the founders relentlessly pushed forward and continued trying to grow the app, get more users on board. Now, by that time, despite the different bugs that they were running up against, people were still starting to use Waze on a wider scale. And then in 2012, there was a tipping point. Apple actually released an updated version of Apple Maps, and it was kind of a disaster. It didn't work, and Tim Cook, the CEO, actually came out and said, look, the app is really buggy, it needs some work. In the meantime, you should use different navigational apps to help you get from point A to point B, and Waze was actually one of the apps he mentioned. Waze had no idea Tim Cook was going to mention their app, but it kind of skyrocketed their user base. And then in 2013, as I mentioned before, Google actually bought Waze for between 1 billion and 1.3 billion. So quick recap of that, they launched a buggy app. They tried to get funding, but really struggled to because they couldn't convey the value of the app or their vision. They tried expanding their app over into the United States and ran into continued bugs and issues, but people still started to adopt the app because it was still more useful than their current GPS systems they were using. Tim Cook happened to mention Waze when Apple was running into its own issues. And then lastly, the Google buyout. So what can you as a no-code app entrepreneur take away from this and apply to your own app and your own journey towards success? Well, first things first, I've mentioned a few times that Waze was buggy. There were issues with the app, and honestly, in some cases, it was kind of confusing to use in those early stages. But the important thing to recognize here, and really, really think about this and think about it often, Waze still launched. They still launched the app, and in fact, they still expanded the app into another country even with the bugs, even with the issues. And the lesson here is that you don't have to launch with a perfect app. It doesn't have to be designed beautifully and it doesn't have to be functionally perfect, but it does need to solve a problem. And Waze was doing that. It wasn't solving the problem perfectly, but it was still solving the problem, and the Waze team was consistently trying and pushing to solve that problem better and better and better, even with live bugs and issues. Okay, so this app that was bought for $1 billion launched with bugs and issues, and yet they still had that massive buyout. The second takeaway here is that one of the big parts of Waze's story was when they struggled to get that funding before they expanded into the US. And this was one of the things that really stuck out for them as a company. They couldn't get funding because they had such a hard time conveying the value of their app and conveying their vision. In fact, at one point, Waze was seen as a social media app for drivers. Now, that's kind of crazy because if you're driving, why in the world would you want to be on social media? Please don't do that. But they had a really hard time conveying the value and the vision. They struggled because of it. One of the first things we talk about with our own entrepreneurs in our private client program is their why. What is actually driving them to build the app? In other words, what's the bigger picture goal? What's the bigger picture problem they're solving? The bigger picture outcomes they are enabling? This is really important for you to think about, because even if you can talk about your app's functionality all day, every day, ad nauseum, you have to be able to convey the vision in a way that gets someone else excited about it. Now, if you can do that, then you can get users, you can get investors, you can get partners, whatever you want to do, but you have to be able to convey the value and your vision. Hey, by the way, before we go any further, if you are wanting to become a successful no-code app entrepreneur, maybe you've already started building your no-code app, or maybe you're still in the planning phases, we have a free deep dive workshop over at coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop. You can find the link for that in the description. Join in on that workshop and we will walk you through how to make sure your app idea is valid, scope that out, start using and understanding no-code tools, and even start building different features of an application. So head to coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop to join in on that. Now, the third lesson I want you to take away from this relates to when Tim Cook mentioned Waze after Apple had their own fiasco when they launched updates to their own navigational app and it was really buggy. First, kind of a sub-thought on this. Apple launched a product and it was really buggy. So buggy that they actually recommended their users and their customers to use other apps. Now, you might not have even known this happened. And the fact that that's probably true should show you that it's okay to launch something that's not perfect. But in regard to Waze specifically, Tim Cook would not have ever suggested or mentioned Waze if they hadn't consistently and relentlessly continued to push their app forward despite it being buggy and sometimes a little bit confusing. Think about that for a second. Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, suggested using Waze, an app that was certainly not perfect at all. Why in the world would he suggest using an app like that? Well, because it was still solving a problem. But you have to understand that Tim Cook would not have even had Waze on his radar if the team at Waze hadn't been relentlessly pushing forward with the app despite all of the roadblocks they were coming up against. They were facing what a lot of people would have seen as failures and reasons to kind of throw in the towel, right? Having such a buggy app, having a really hard time getting funding, but they didn't see those failures as reasons to stop. They saw them as lessons that would help them improve. And that's the reason why Tim Cook was even able to have Waze on his radar and suggest it. And that is what put them on the map, pun intended, and led to their ultimate success. And the fourth thing I want you to take away from this is related to that billion-dollar buyout. Now, a lot of people would look at something like that being purchased by Google for $1 billion. I think of the original 100 employees on the Waze team at the time. I'm pretty sure every single one of them got around $1.2 million from that buyout, right? So we're talking a lot of money, but a lot of people see that type of a buyout as luck, right? They could never fathom achieving something like that because it so rarely happens. And therefore it has to be because of luck or because of some factor that is just out of reach for them. But that's not the case. Waze didn't get lucky. They really just put in a lot of hard, unending, relentless work. Going back to those failures versus lessons, they could have thrown in the towel so many times due to those different roadblocks and setbacks, but they didn't. They didn't see those as reasons to quit. They saw those as reasons to adapt and to pivot and to improve. And for anyone who can do that, who can see failures as lessons and reasons to continue forward in better ways, you are unstoppable. You are unstoppable. Because it doesn't matter if you ultimately succeed with your original app idea or not. If you have an app idea and you put it out there, you actually put it out there and you get feedback, and that feedback tells you that things aren't working, or maybe you're not conveying the value, or maybe what you have just isn't valuable. You can quit, certainly. But if instead you take that feedback and you adapt and change and continue pushing forward in a way that takes that feedback in mind and gives people what they need, you are unstoppable. So listen, put yourself out there, really put your app out there and see what type of success story you can create for yourself. All right, thanks so much for watching. I hope this was helpful, and we'll see you in the next one.